The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting shadows that danced across the weathered face of Nathan Garrett. At 67 years old, his hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent working the land, and his eyes held the quiet wisdom that came from surviving more winters than most men could imagine. He sat in the chair that had been his for nearly 3 decades, watching the flames while his grandson stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered Montana landscape. Thomas Garrett Jr. held a piece of paper in his trembling hands. The draft notice had arrived that morning, and the boy, just 19 years old, couldn't stop looking at it, as if staring hard enough might make the words disappear. Outside, the world was at war. Boys his age were dying in trenches across an ocean, and soon he would join them. Grandpa Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm scared. The war in France, they say so many men don't come back." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He had learned long ago that some fears couldn't be dismissed with easy words. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, broken only by the snap and pop of burning wood. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what his grandson was feeling. "Sit down here, boy. I'm going to tell you a story." Tommy turned from the window, his young face drawn with anxiety. He'd heard his grandfather's stories before, tales of early Montana, of harsh winters and harder men. But something in the old man's tone tonight was different, something urgent. The boy crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite his grandfather. Between them, a small table held 2 cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. On the wall behind Nathan, photographs told their own story. A younger Nathan with a woman whose smile could light up a room. 4 children of varying ages standing proud on the ranch's front porch. And in the center, a formal portrait, the kind people took for anniversaries, showing that same couple decades later, their faces lined with time, but their eyes still bright with something that looked like love. 28 years ago, Nathan began in December of 1890. "I stood in a church and watched a woman that 23 men had refused." He paused, letting that image settle in his grandson's mind. "Your grandmother Maggie, she stood there with her chin up, even though the whole world was telling her she wasn't worth anything. And I stepped forward, not because I was brave, but because I knew what it felt like when someone decides you're not worth their time." Tommy leaned forward, drawn in despite his fear. "Grandma Maggie. But she was always so strong." A ghost of a smile crossed Nathan's face. "She is now. But that day, she was as scared as you are right now, maybe more scared, because at least you know what you were walking into." She had no idea what kind of hell she was stepping into when she accepted my hand. The old man's gaze drifted to the photographs on the wall, and for a moment he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and desperate, where a woman with nothing but 17 cents and determination had gambled everything on a stranger's word. "This story," Nathan said slowly, "it's not about courage, Tommy. Not the kind you're thinking of anyway. It's about knowing what you're worth, even when nobody else believes it. You're about to go to a battlefield. You're going to face moments when you're terrified, when you think you're not strong enough. But I want you to remember something. Sometimes the person nobody wants becomes the person someone needs most." He settled back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment as memory pulled him back across the decades. Now imagine Montana in December of 1890, snow falling thick as wool, wind that could strip the skin off your bones, and a woman standing in a church while men who should have known better decided she wasn't good enough for them. Nathan's voice dropped lower, taking on the cadence of a born storyteller, and as he spoke, the room around them seemed to fade. The fire's light became the flickering candles of a frontier church. The wind outside became the howl of a blizzard that would test everything a person had to give. And Tommy Jr., holding his draft notice with white-knuckled hands, leaned forward to hear how his grandparents' story began. The church smelled of pine smoke and desperation. Margaret Hayes stood at the front of Bitter Creek's only house of worship, her fingers numb inside threadbare gloves that had been made for Boston winters, not Montana ones. December wind howled outside, rattling the windows with a violence that reminded everyone present that winter in this territory wasn't something you merely endured. It was something you survived if you were lucky. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat for what must have been the 3rd time. The old man had no relation to Margaret despite sharing a name, and right now she was grateful for that small mercy. At least no one could say she'd used family connections to arrange this humiliation. "Gentlemen," the Reverend said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd performed this particular duty too many times. "Miss Hayes has traveled from Boston. She's seeking honest work and a good home. Who among you will step forward?" Silence fell like a stone down a well. Margaret kept her chin up. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only invited cruelty, but inside something fragile was cracking. 23 men stood in that church. Ranchers, miners, shopkeepers. All of them needing wives, needing help, needing someone to warm their beds and raise their children. The mail-order bride agency back east had promised her that Montana men were desperate for women. They hadn't mentioned that desperation had limits. "She's too thin," someone muttered from the back. "Won't last the winter. Look at them hands. Soft city hands. Won't hold up to real work." "How old is she?" 25, 30s, 28. Margaret said clearly, her voice cutting through the whispers. "I'm 28 years old. I've worked in textile mills since I was 12. I can cook, clean, mend, and manage a household. I don't need pretty things or easy work. I just need a chance." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the muttering had been. Then from the front pew came a sound that made Margaret's blood run cold. Laughter, high and sharp like breaking ice. Oh, how inspiring. The voice belonged to Victoria Sterling, wrapped in furs that probably cost more than Margaret had earned in 5 years of factory work. Even in a frontier church, some women found ways to be queens. Her husband owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and she never let anyone forget it. A mill worker who can mend, Victoria continued, her smile poisonous. "Surely that's worth a lifetime commitment." Margaret turned to look at her directly. "I'm not asking for commitment, ma'am. I'm asking for a chance to prove my worth." Victoria's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "My dear, your worth was determined the moment you stepped off that stage. These men have eyes. They can see exactly what you're worth." Heat flooded Margaret's face. Not from embarrassment, from fury. The kind of fury she'd learned to swallow during 10 years of factory work. 10 years of being treated as disposable. 10 years of men like William Thornton believing they owned her simply because they signed her paychecks. "Then I reckon I'll find out what I'm worth on my own," Margaret said. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I'll trouble you no further." She stepped down from the small platform where the Reverend had positioned her like livestock at auction. Her boots clicked against the wooden floor, loud in the terrible silence. She could feel every eye on her back, pitying, dismissing, already forgetting. The church door was 15 feet away, then 10, then 5. Her hand reached for the handle. The cold metal bit through her glove. "Wait." The voice came from behind her, deep and rough and tired. The voice of a man who'd forgotten how to use it for anything but giving orders to cattle and children. Margaret turned slowly. He stood in the shadows near the back of the church, half hidden by a wooden pillar. She hadn't noticed him before, hadn't counted him among the 23 who'd rejected her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better decades. His face was weathered like old leather, his jaw covered in stubble that said he'd stopped caring about appearances a long time ago. But his eyes, dark brown, almost black in the dim light of the church. Those eyes were looking at her like she was something worth seeing. "I'll take her," he said. The church erupted. "Nathan Garrett, you can't be serious. That man's got 4 children already. His last 2 housekeepers ran off before spring. She'll never survive out at his place." The man called Nathan ignored them all. He walked forward, his boots heavy on the floor, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. When he reached her, he stopped and tipped his hat. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost courtly, completely at odds with his rough appearance. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Nathan Garrett. I've got a ranch 10 miles north of here. 4 children who need tending. A house that needs managing. It's hard work and the winters are harder, but I keep my word and I'll treat you fair." Margaret studied him. "Why me, pardon? 23 men in this church, not one of them would have me. Why you?" Something flickered in his dark eyes. "Pain, maybe? Or recognition? Because I know what it's like to stand somewhere while everyone decides you ain't worth their time," he said quietly. "And I know that some moms, the ones nobody wants, are the ones who work the hardest because they've got something to prove." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I've got 17 cents to my name, Mr. Garrett. I've got nowhere to sleep tonight. You could be offering me anything and I'd have to take it. You sure you want someone that desperate?" "Desperate ain't the same as weak, Miss Hayes." His voice was steady. I've been desperate myself. Still am some days. He held out his hand. So must so. You coming or not? She looked at his hand. Calloused, scarred the hand of a man who'd worked harder than most people could imagine. Then she looked at his face, searching for the cruelty that experience had taught her to expect from men who held power over her. She found none. I'm coming, she said, and placed her hand in his. The wagon waited outside, already loaded with supplies. A sturdy gray horse stamped impatiently in the cold breath, steaming in the frozen air. Nathan helped Margaret up onto the bench, his hand firm, but not grasping, supporting without claiming. Climb up, he said. We need to move. Storm's coming and I want to be home before it hits. Margaret settled onto the hard wooden seat, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. It was a coat meant for Boston winters, not Montana ones. Already she could feel the cold seeping through, finding every gap, every weakness. Nathan climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked to the horse. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching through the snow that had already accumulated on Bitter Creek's main street. Behind them, faces pressed against the church windows, watching, judging, already spinning stories about the desperate woman and the broken rancher. Let them look, Nathan said, as if reading her thoughts. They'll talk no matter what we do. Might as well give them something to talk about. Do they talk about you often? Some. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. My wife died 3 years back. Folks expected me to remarry quick, get someone to help with the children. When I didn't, they started talking. Said I was touched by grief. Said I couldn't let go. Said my children were running wild. Were they right about the grief, I mean? Yes. Margaret waited, but he didn't elaborate. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. Finally, she tried again. And your children, are they running wild? A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. They ain't wild. They're just lost, same as me. The town fell away behind them, buildings giving way to endless white prairie. The wind picked up, driving snow into their faces. Margaret pulled the collar of her inadequate coat higher, trying to protect what little warmth she had left. Tell me about them, she said. Your children. Nathan was quiet for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts, or maybe deciding how much truth to share with this stranger who'd just agreed to come live in his home. Daniel's 13, he said finally. Danny, we call him. He's the oldest. Takes everything too serious. Tries to be the man of the house when he should still be a boy. He'll be the hardest to win over. He remembers his mother best. Margaret nodded, filing away each detail. And the other, Sarah's 10. Charlotte, but everyone calls her Sarah. Quiet girl, loves her books, watches everything, says little. She's been waiting for someone to teach her what her mother would have taught her, but she won't admit it. How do you know then? Because I'm her father. Nathan's voice was soft. I might not be good at a lot of things, but I know my children. What about the younger ones? Thomas is 7. Tommy, all energy, no direction. Gets into everything, breaks half of what he touches. But he's got a good heart under all that chaos. He needs attention, and I haven't had enough to give. And the youngest, something in Nathan's expression softened even further. Rose. She just turned 4. Doesn't remember her mother much anymore. She carries a rag doll her mother made before. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Before she got sick. Rose is scared of people leaving. You need to understand that going in. She'll attach to you fast, and if you leave, it'll break something in her. I won't leave. Nathan glanced at her. You say that now, I mean it now too. The last 2 women I hired said the same thing. First one lasted 3 weeks. Said it was too isolated, too much work, too cold. Second one made it to February before she packed her things in the middle of the night and walked to town. Didn't even say goodbye to the children. Margaret felt anger flare in her chest. Not at Nathan, but at those women. At anyone who could look at grieving children and decide their own comfort mattered more. I'm not them, she said. No, Nathan agreed slowly. I don't reckon you are. They rode in silence for a while after that. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the horses breathing, the endless whisper of wind through snow. Margaret's fingers were going numb despite her gloves, and she tucked them under her arms for warmth. Nathan noticed. Without a word, he reached behind the seat and produced a heavy wool blanket, draping it over her lap. Thank you, Margaret said, surprised by the gesture. Can't have you freezing before we get there. My children are expecting someone who can cook supper. Is that all they're expecting? Nathan was quiet for a long moment. They're expecting someone who will leave. That's what they've learned, that people leave. Their mother left not by choice, but she left all the same. Everyone since then has left by choice. So they'll test you, push you, see how far they have to go before you give up on them. And what should I do when they push back? He glanced at her, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. But gentle. Firm, but gentle. Let them know you see what they're doing, and you're staying anyway. The road curved, climbing a gentle rise. When they crested it, Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop. There, he said, pointing. Margaret looked down into a valley sheltered by a ring of hills. She saw a main house, 2 stories built solid against the weather. A barn, several outbuildings, a corral with a few horses huddled against the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the heavy white sky. It's not much, Nathan said, but it's home. Something in Margaret's chest loosened. It wasn't a grand estate. It wasn't the fancy house William Thornton had tried to trap her in back in Boston. It was a working ranch, practical and plain. Exactly the kind of place where people survived by their own labor and nobody pretended to be anything they weren't. It looks like home, she said quietly. Nathan looked at her strangely, as if she'd said something unexpected. Then he clicked to the horse and started down toward the valley. The front door burst open before the wagon had fully stopped. 4 faces appeared on the porch. 3 children clustering together. 1 small figure hanging back in the doorway. Margaret studied them, quickly matching faces to the descriptions Nathan had given her. Danny stood at the front, tall for 13. His dark hair windblown and his expression guarded. His eyes blue like winter ice, fixed on Margaret with open suspicion. Sarah hovered beside him, brown braids escaping their ribbons, a book clutched to her chest like armor. She was watching Margaret with the careful attention of a child who'd learned that observation was safer than participation. Tommy bounced on his toes, unable to stand still. His face was split with curiosity and barely contained energy. He was already talking before anyone else could speak. Is that her? Is that the lady? She looks cold. Is she going to stay? Can she cook? Can she, Tommy? Danny's voice was sharp, quiet. The boy subsided, but his eyes never left Margaret. And in the doorway, half hidden by the frame, stood Rose, 4 years old, clutching a faded rag doll. Her blonde hair was tangled, and her brown eyes were huge with uncertainty. Nathan climbed down from the wagon and reached up to help Margaret. His hands were steady warm despite the cold. Children, he said, turning to face them. This is Miss Margaret Hayes. She's going to be staying with us, helping with the house, helping with you. For how long? Danny asked immediately. For as long as she wants to stay. So she'll leave too. The boy's voice was flat, dismissive, just like the others. Margaret stepped forward before Nathan could respond. You're Danny, the boy blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. Yeah, so your father told me about you on the ride here, said you're serious, responsible, that you've been trying to fill your father's shoes and your mother's shoes all at once. Danny's jaw tightened. Someone had to. That's true, Margaret said. Someone did, and you stepped up when no one else could. That takes strength. She held his gaze. But here's the thing about carrying that much weight. Eventually it breaks you. Not because you're weak, but because no one person should have to carry everything alone. What do you know about it? I know I've been carrying weight since I was 12 years old. Working in factories. Taking care of myself because no one else would. Fighting to survive every single day. Margaret's voice was steady. I know exactly what it costs, Danny. And I know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone help. The boy stared at her, his expression shifting from hostility to something more complicated. Confusion, maybe, or the first flicker of respect. That doesn't mean you're staying, he said finally. No, Margaret agreed. It doesn't. Only time will prove that. So I guess we'll both have to wait and see. Sarah stepped forward, her book still pressed to her chest. Can you read? She asked quietly. Yes, I can read. Really read. Not just a little. I've read Shakespeare and Dickens and anything else I could get my hands on. Reading was the only escape I had in the factories. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Hope quickly suppressed. Oh, that's good. Tommy pushed between his siblings, unable to contain himself any longer. Can you cook? Pa's cooking is terrible. I mean, he tries, but it's really, really bad. Caleb's is worse. Sarah burned the beans last week and Tommy. Danny and Sarah spoke in unison, both flushing. Margaret felt a smile tugging at her lips. I can cook. I used to make bread that people lined up to buy. Real bread, not the flat kind that tastes like rocks. Real bread. Tommy's eyes went wide with wonder. Soft and warm with butter melting into it. That's the kind. I like you already. Tommy, you can't just... Can I like her? She's nice and she can make bread. Margaret laughed. A real laugh, the first one in longer than she could remember. You can reserve judgment, Tommy. That's probably wiser. I might burn the bread. You never know. You won't, the boy said with absolute certainty. I can tell. The only one who hadn't spoken was Rose. The little girl still hovered in the doorway, her rag doll dangling from one hand, her eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that seemed too heavy for a 4-year-old. Margaret crouched down, making herself smaller, less threatening. Hello, Rose. I like your doll. What's her name, Rose? Clutches the doll tighter. Sunny. That's a beautiful name. Did you choose it? A tiny headshake. Mama named her. Margaret's heart clenched. Your mama had good taste in names. Sunny is perfect. Rose studied her for a long moment, her small face solemn. Are you going to sleep here? If your father says I can, yes. Are you going to sleep here forever? The question hung in the cold air, weighted with everything a 4-year-old couldn't say but somehow understood. Margaret chose her words carefully. I'm going to sleep here for as long as your father will have me. I can't promise forever. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise that if I ever have to leave, I'll tell you first. I won't disappear in the night. I won't leave without saying goodbye. Rose considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned too young that adults didn't always keep their word. Promise, promise, the little girl nodded slowly. Then in a movement that surprised everyone, she stepped out of the doorway and slipped her small hand into Margaret's. Okay, Rose said, you can come inside now. It's cold. The house was warmer than Margaret had expected, heated by a large stone fireplace that dominated the main room. But warmth was relative. She could still see her breath in the corners farthest from the fire, and the windows were rimmed with frost. She surveyed the space, quickly cataloging what she saw. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A large wooden table with mismatched chairs, shelves lined with dishes, pots, and supplies in varying states of organization. And near the fireplace, a rocking chair, empty, with a woman's shawl still draped over its back. Margaret looked away from the shawl. Some things weren't hers to touch yet, maybe ever. I'll show you to your room, Nathan said. It's small, but it's private. Used to be the sewing room. That's fine. I don't need much space. They walked down a short hallway, the children following at a distance, whispering among themselves. Margaret could feel their eyes on her back, measuring, judging, waiting to see what kind of person she would prove to be. Nathan opened a door at the end of the hall. Here. The room was indeed small, just enough space for a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a small trunk at the foot of the bed. But it had a window that looked out toward the hills, and the bed had clean sheets. It's perfect, Margaret said and meant it. Nathan nodded, hovering in the doorway. Supper's usually at 6. The children have their chores. I'll explain those tomorrow. Tonight, just settle in. Get warm. You've had a long day. Mr. Garrett, he paused. Yes, thank you for stepping forward, for giving me a chance when no one else would. Something shifted in his expression. Pain, gratitude, something complicated that she couldn't quite read. Don't thank me yet, Miss Hayes. You haven't seen how hard it gets. I've seen hard, Mr. Garrett. Margaret gestured around her at the small room. The distant sound of children arguing, the wind howling outside. This is just different. Different isn't the same as hard. He studied her for a moment as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe you're exactly what we needed. He left, closing the door behind him. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her whole body starting to shake now that she was finally alone. Not from cold, from the release of tension she'd been holding since she'd stepped off that stage in Bitter Creek. She'd done it. She'd found a place. Not a home, not yet, but a place where she might build one. From the main room, she could hear voices. Danny's sharp and suspicious. She won't last. None of them do. Sarah's quieter. Maybe she's different. Tommy's enthusiastic. She can make bread, Danny. Real bread. And underneath it all, Nathan's low rumble, too quiet for her to make out the words. She touched the bed, the dresser, the frost-covered window. Real things, solid things, things that wouldn't disappear when William Thornton decided he wanted them. William. The thought of him hit her like cold water. He was still out there, still looking for her, still believing she belonged to him. She'd told herself that Montana was far enough, that the frontier was wild enough to swallow a woman and keep her hidden. But standing in that church today, feeling the eyes of strangers cataloging her worth, she'd realized something terrible. She wasn't hidden. She was exposed. A mail-order bride from Boston arriving in December, rejected by 23 men. That was a story. Stories traveled. Stories could be traced. If William was looking, he would find her eventually. But that was a problem for another day. Today, she had a different battle to fight. 4 children who expected her to leave. A rancher who'd forgotten how to hope. And a winter that was trying its best to kill them all. Margaret straightened her shoulders. She'd survived William Thornton's hands on her in darkened hallways. She'd survived the factory that broke women's backs and spirits. She'd survived the train ride west with nothing but 17 cents and a stubborn refusal to give up. She would survive this too. A knock on her door. Small, hesitant. "Come in," Margaret said. The door opened to reveal Rose still clutching Sonny. The little girl stood on the threshold looking uncertain. "I wanted to see if you were still here," Rose said. "I'm still here. Sometimes people are here and then they're not. They go away while you're sleeping." Margaret's heart broke a little. She held out her hand. "Come here, sweetheart." Rose crossed the small room and climbed onto the bed beside Margaret. She was warm and solid, smelling of wood smoke and something sweet. Honey, maybe. "I'm not going to disappear while you're sleeping," Margaret said gently. "When you wake up tomorrow, I'll be here. And the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, promise." Rose leaned against Margaret's side, her small body relaxing. "Okay, Sonny believes you. Sonny's good at knowing who to believe." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, the wind howling outside the house, creaking around them. 2 strangers, one who'd lost everything and one who'd never had anything, beginning the slow, uncertain work of becoming something more. From down the hall, Nathan's voice called on. "Rose, where'd you go?" "I'm with Miss Margaret," Rose shouted back. "I'm helping her feel not alone." A pause, then Nathan appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He looked at his daughter, curled against the stranger's side, at the way Rose's small hand clutched Margaret's sleeve. "Supper's almost ready," he said quietly. "You're welcome to join us. Both of you." Margaret nodded, lifting Rose and settling the child on her hip as naturally as if she'd been doing it for years. "We'll be right there." Nathan watched them for a moment longer. Something in his expression shifted the first crack in that wall of grief and weariness he'd built around himself. Then he nodded and walked away. Rose patted Margaret's cheek with one small hand. "I'm hungry." "Then let's go eat. Will there be bread?" "Not tonight, but tomorrow I'll make some, I promise." "You promise a lot of things." Margaret smiled, the first real smile she'd given since arriving in Montana. "I know, but here's the thing about promises, Rose. The only way they mean anything is if you keep them. So I only promise things I can do." Rose considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned too young that adults didn't always keep their word. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll wait and see. That's all I ask." They walked out together into the warmth of the main room, toward the family waiting around the table. Danny's suspicious eyes, Sarah's careful hope, Tommy's irrepressible enthusiasm, and Nathan standing by the stove watching Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. Outside, the storm hit with full force. Snow driving against the windows. Wind screaming around the corners of the house. They were trapped here now, all of them together with no choice but to figure out how to survive each other. Margaret took her seat at the table, Rose refusing to let go of her hand. Nathan served out portions of stew that looked marginally better than what Tommy had described earlier. "Well," Nathan said, his voice gruff. "Welcome to the Garrett Ranch, Miss Hayes. I hope you're ready for the hardest winter of your life." Margaret looked around the table at the faces watching her. Weary, hopeful, desperate, lost. Then she picked up her spoon and took a bite of stew. "I've been getting ready for this my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until today." And somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where hope had been frozen solid for years, something small and warm began to thaw. Nathan refilled his coffee cup, the dark liquid steaming in the firelight. His grandson sat forward in his chair, now drawn into the story, despite the fear that still clung to him like morning frost. The old man took a sip, letting the silence stretch between them before continuing. The first week, Tommy, that's when we all learned to trust each other. Not through words, through actions, through the small things we did every single day. How do you mean, Tommy Jr. asked? Nathan smiled, a soft expression that made the lines around his eyes deepen. Like your grandmother waking before dawn every morning. Like her never complaining even when her hands swelled from the cold. Like the way she treated each child as if they were already hers even though they weren't. Not yet. The old man's gaze drifted to the photographs again, lingering on one that showed a younger Maggie standing in the ranch kitchen, flour dusting her apron, surrounded by 4 children who looked at her with something approaching wonder. Let me tell you about that second morning, Nathan said. The morning when everything started to change. Margaret woke before dawn, her small room dark as a cave. Her breath was visible in the frigid air, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back. The church. The rejection. Nathan Garrett's rough voice saying he'd take her. The children watching her with their wounded, wary eyes. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her fingers clumsy with cold, and made her way to the kitchen. Nathan was already there, standing at the stove and struggling with the fire, cursing softly under his breath. When he heard her footsteps, he turned, surprise flickering across his weathered face. You're up early. So are you. Ranch doesn't run itself, especially not in winter. He gestured at the stove. Damn thing won't catch properly. Flu's been temperamental since October. Margaret moved to his side, studying the arrangement of kindling and logs. May I? He stepped back, watching as she adjusted the flue, rearranged the kindling, and coaxed a small flame to life. Within minutes, the fire was burning steadily, heat beginning to radiate into the cold kitchen. Where'd you learn that? Nathan asked. Factory dormitories, 40 women sharing 3 stoves. You learn fast, or you freeze? He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his dark eyes. Coffee's in the tin on the shelf. I usually just make it strong enough to wake the dead. I'll see what I can do. They worked in silence for a while, Margaret preparing coffee while Nathan pulled on his coat and boots. The easy quiet between them felt strange, comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. I'll be in the barn, he said, pausing at the door. Cattle need tending, and one of the horses has been favoring her left leg. Children usually wake around 7. Danny knows the morning routine. I'll have breakfast ready. Nathan hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. Miss Hayes. Yes, yesterday. In the church. What you said about standing somewhere while everyone decides you ain't worth their time. He didn't look at her. I meant what I said. I know that feeling, and I know what it costs to keep standing anyway. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing behind him and letting in a blast of frozen air that made the new fire sputter. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she shook herself and got to work. By the time the children stumbled out of their rooms, she had coffee brewing, eggs frying, and the first batch of biscuits nearly ready. The smell filled the house, warm and inviting, pushing back against the winter cold. Tommy appeared first, his hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes going wide when he saw the stove. You're cooking, he said, as if witnessing a miracle. That's generally what happens in a kitchen. But it smells good. It smells really good. Thank you. Set the table, please. Plates are on the shelf. Tommy blinked, clearly unused to being given tasks so directly, but he moved to obey, pulling down plates with more enthusiasm than care. Sarah came next, already dressed, her braids neater than they'd been yesterday. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Margaret at the stove, Tommy setting the table. The smell of actual food cooking. You're still here, she said quietly. I told you I would be. The last one said that too. She left on the 3rd day. I'm not her. Sarah considered this, her book clutched to her chest as always. What are you reading? Margaret asked, nodding toward the worn cover. Jane Eyre. Ma gave it to me before. The girl stopped, her face closing. That's one of my favorites, Margaret said gently. Jane's had a hard life, but she never loses herself. Never becomes cruel even when people are cruel to her. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. You've read it 3 times. I used to read it when things got bad at the factory. Reminded me that survival doesn't have to mean losing who you are. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, the first crack in her careful armor. Maybe, she said slowly, maybe we could talk about it sometime. About the book, I like that. Danny appeared last fully dressed, his expression already set in that guarded mask Margaret was beginning to recognize. He stopped short when he saw the kitchen, his eyes narrowing. What are you doing? Making breakfast. Pa usually does that. Your father's in the barn. I thought I'd help. Margaret began transferring eggs onto plates. Sit down. Food's ready. Danny didn't move. We don't need your help. Margaret set down the pan and turned to face him. I know you don't trust me. I know you're waiting for me to leave, just like everyone else left. And I know that every morning I'm still here, it feels more dangerous because the longer I stay, the more it'll hurt when I go. The boy's face went pale. I didn't. But here's the thing, Margaret crossed to him, stopping close enough to see the fear beneath his anger. I'm not planning to go. And every day I'm here, I'm going to do my job. Make meals, clean the house, help where I can. You can be angry about it, or you can accept it and let me make your life a little easier. Either way, I'm staying. Danny stared at her, his jaw working. For a moment, Margaret thought he might yell, might storm out, might do any of the things a 13-year-old boy did when he felt cornered. Instead, he sat down at the table. The biscuits better be good, he muttered. They're excellent, Margaret said calmly, but you can judge for yourself. Rose wandered in just as Margaret was serving Sunny, dragging along the floor behind her. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Margaret. You're still here, forever. Let's start with today and see how it goes. Rose climbed into her chair, then patted the seat beside her. Sit next to me. I need to finish cooking. After. All right, after. The door opened, bringing cold air and Nathan stomping snow from his boots. He stopped when he saw the table. 4 children eating, the kitchen warm and smelling of fresh food, everything running smoothly. You've been busy, he said. I told you I could cook. Nathan hung up his coat and moved to the table, taking his place at the head. He picked up a biscuit, examined it, took a bite. His eyebrows rose. These are more than edible. Better than edible, Margaret offered. These are... He took another bite, chewing slowly. Where'd you learn to cook like this? Same place I learned everything else. Necessity. When you grow up without much, you learn to make the most of what you have. Tommy was already on his 3rd biscuit. Can you make these every day? If we have the supplies, we need supplies, Tommy said with his mouth full. We need so many supplies. We need... Tommy, Nathan's voice carried warning, but his eyes were warm. One breakfast at a time. Nathan paused in his story, glancing at his grandson. The boy was leaning forward now, his draft notice temporarily forgotten on the table beside him. You see, Tommy, those first days weren't about grand gestures or big promises. They were about showing up, about doing the work, about proving yourself one biscuit at a time. Tommy Jr. smiled despite himself. Grandma's biscuits are still the best I've ever tasted. They are, Nathan agreed. But back then, they were more than just food. They were proof that someone cared enough to get up before dawn and make something good happen. The days fell into a rhythm. Margaret woke early, started the fire-made breakfast. Nathan went to tend the livestock while the children ate. Danny and Tommy helped their father during the day. Sarah and Rose stayed with Margaret, learning the household tasks their mother had never had time to teach them. Each day, Margaret earned a little more ground. With Sarah, it was books. They started reading Jane Eyre together in the evenings, Margaret helping with the harder words, discussing the story in the quiet moments between chores. Sarah began to thaw her careful silence, giving way to actual conversation. One afternoon, while Margaret was mending a torn shirt, Sarah sat beside her with her book. Miss Margaret, yes, dear? In the story, Jane says she'd rather be happy than dignified. Do you think that's true? That you have to choose, Margaret set down her sewing, considering the question carefully. I think dignity without happiness is just armor, and happiness without dignity is just pretending. Jane understood that real strength comes from being true to yourself even when it costs you something. Is that what you did when you left Boston? Margaret met the girl's eyes. Yes, I chose being true to myself over being comfortable. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. I'm glad you did. With Rose, it was simpler. The little girl had adopted Margaret with the fierce possessiveness of a child who'd decided something belonged to her. She followed Margaret everywhere, helped with everything, and fell asleep each night with her hand wrapped in Margaret's. One evening, as Margaret tucked Rose into bed, the child looked up at her with solemn eyes. Are you my mama now? Margaret's breath caught. I'm not your mama, sweetheart. Your mama was someone very special, but I can be someone who loves you and takes care of you if you'd like that. Rose considered this with her usual gravity. Can I call you mama anyway? I don't remember my other mama very much, and I want a mama. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. If that's what you want, and if your father says it's all right, then yes, you can call me mama. Rose smiled a rare, full smile that transformed her small face. Okay, mama. Good night. Good night, sweetheart. With Tommy, it was food. The boy was a bottomless pit of hunger and enthusiasm, and Margaret's cooking became the way to his heart. He started calling her Miss Margaret instead of the new lady and began volunteering for kitchen duties just to be near the stove. On the fifth day, he broke a plate while helping to wash up. He froze, waiting for the yelling that had apparently come before. Margaret simply handed him a broom. Accidents happen. Help me clean up. You're not mad? Did you break it on purpose? No. Then why would I be mad? Clean up. Learn to be more careful next time. Tommy looked at her as if she'd grown a second head. Then carefully he swept up the pieces, his small face serious with concentration. With Danny, progress was slower. The boy maintained his distance, still watching with those eyes that expected disappointment. But he began helping without being asked. Carrying water, bringing in firewood. Small gestures that said more than words could. On the seventh day, he brought water in without saying anything, setting it down beside Margaret at the stove. He started to leave. Thank you, Danny. The boy's shoulders tensed. It's just water. I know, but I still appreciate it. He turned to look at her. Are you really going to stay? Margaret met his eyes. I really am. How do I know that you don't? Not yet, but you will if you give me time. Nathan observed these changes with something approaching wonder. Each evening he returned from the barn to find the kitchen warm, the smell of food cooking, his children actually laughing with each other. Margaret moved through the space as if she'd been there for years. One night after the children were asleep, Nathan stayed at the kitchen table while Margaret cleaned up. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I need to go to town, Nathan said abruptly. Supplies are getting low and I need to check on a few things. Will you be all right here with the children? Of course, Danny can handle the basic chores and Sarah knows the routine. We'll manage. Take your time. Nathan nodded, but he didn't move. He sat there watching her wipe down the counter, his expression thoughtful. Miss Hayes, yesterday when I was checking the far pasture, I found tracks near the property line. Margaret's hands stilled. Tracks, not animal tracks. Boot prints, like someone was watching. Her blood ran cold. Watching someone's been out there, Nathan said quietly. I think for a while now. Fear leaped into Margaret's throat, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Could be drifters. Could be. Nathan's eyes searched her face. But you don't think so. You know who it might be. Not a question. A statement. Margaret set down the rag she'd been using, her hands trembling slightly. There was a man in Boston. The man I worked for. When I refused him, he made my life hell, threatened to destroy my reputation, make sure I could never work again. So I ran. And you think he's followed you? I'm not sure, but he's the kind of man who doesn't forget. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. We'll be careful, Nathan finally said. Extra locks. Keep the children close to the house. And if he shows up, we'll deal with it. Together. Margaret nodded, but fear had settled deep in her bones. William was coming. She could feel it. And when he came, everything she was building here might shatter. Nathan stopped his story, looking at his grandson with eyes that had seen too much. That was when we knew danger was coming, he said. When we found those tracks. But we didn't know how bad it would get. Not yet. What happened next? Tommy Jr. asked. A storm, Nathan said. The kind that tests everything you have. The blizzard hit on the 8th day, coming down with a violence that shook the house. Nathan and Danny spent hours digging out paths to the barn and the well while Margaret kept the fire burning and food coming. By evening, they were snowed in completely, the world beyond the windows transformed into howling white chaos. The children felt the tension. Tommy was frightened, his eyes wide with each gust of wind. Sarah withdrew, clutching her book but not reading. Rose clung to Margaret, refusing to let go. And Danny stood by the window, staring out at the deadly white, his face pale and his hands clenched at his sides. Son, Nathan said gently, come away from the window. Nothing out there to see. Danny's voice came out tight, strangled. It's like at the storm. When Mom... He stopped his jaw, clenching so hard Margaret could see the muscle jump. The room went silent. Sarah looked up from her book. Tommy stopped mid-sentence. Rose pressed closer to Margaret. Danny! Nathan started to stand, but Danny exploded, the words bursting out of him like a dam breaking. You said we'd be fine back then. You said we had enough food, enough wood. You said Ma just needed rest, that she'd get better. His voice cracked on the last word. And then Ma. The boy couldn't finish. He turned and ran down the hallway, his door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. Margaret stood. I should... Nathan was already moving toward his son's room. That's my boy. Margaret put her hand on his arm. Let me try. Nathan looked at her, conflict clear in his expression. This was his son, his responsibility, his failure he still carried from 3 years ago. Please, Margaret said quietly. After a long moment, Nathan nodded. If he tells you to leave, respect that. I will. Margaret walked down the hallway past her own small room to the door to the end where Danny had retreated. She knocked softly. Go away, it's Miss Margaret. Silence, then grudgingly, fine. She opened the door. Danny sat on his bed, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. He looked younger than 13 in that moment, looked like the child he'd stopped letting himself be. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, leaving distance between them. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. Then why are you here? Because nobody should sit alone with this kind of hurt. Danny's jaw tightened. What do you know about it? I know what it's like to lose someone and feel like the world should have stopped, but it didn't. I know what it's like to be angry at everyone who's still alive when the person you loved isn't. And I know what it's like to carry guilt that isn't yours. His head snapped toward her. You think it's your fault, Margaret said gently. Something you did or didn't do. Something you should have noticed. Maybe you think if you'd been better tried, harder prayed more, she would have lived. That's not guilt you earned, Danny. That's grief lying to you. The boy's face crumpled, just for a moment before he forced it back into that hard mask. You don't know anything about it. I know that 3 years ago your mother got sick during a storm like this one. I know your father couldn't get help, couldn't save her, couldn't do anything but watch her slip away. And I know that ever since you've been trying to control everything around you. Because if you're in control, nothing bad can happen. No one else can die. Danny stared at her, his breathing ragged. How do you... Because that's what I did too. After my mother died, after I ended up in the factory, I tried to control everything, every detail, every moment. I thought if I was perfect enough, careful enough, I could keep anything bad from happening again. She shook her head. It doesn't work. Bad things happen anyway. All that control does is exhaust you. So what am I supposed to do? The words burst out of him, raw and desperate. Just let things happen. Just accept that people die and there's nothing I can do. No. You fight for the people you love. You do everything you can. But when something's beyond your control, you have to forgive yourself for not being able to stop it. She reached out carefully and covered his hand with hers. Your mother's death wasn't your fault, Danny. It wasn't anyone's fault. Sickness doesn't care about fault. Tears were streaming down his face now. The first tears he'd probably cried in years. I miss her, he whispered. I miss her so much, and everyone keeps trying to replace her. And you want her back. He nodded, unable to speak. I know, sweetheart, I know. Margaret squeezed his hand. And I'm not trying to replace her. No one could do that. She was your mother and she loved you, and that can't be replaced. But maybe there's room for something new alongside what you lost. Not instead of alongside. Danny was quiet for a long time, his tears slowly subsiding. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. The others, the women Pa hired before you, they tried to act like Ma. Used her recipes, wore her apron, tried to do everything exactly like she did. It made me so angry, like they were erasing her. I won't do that, Margaret promised. I'll make my own recipes, find my own way. And if I do something that reminds you too much of her, tell me. I'll try something different. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the hostility finally fading from his eyes. Why do you care? We're nothing to you. You're not nothing. You're 4 children who need someone to care about them. That's not nothing, Danny. That's everything. He wiped his face with his sleeve, embarrassed by his tears. You're different, he said slowly, than the others. I keep telling you that. Maybe I'm starting to believe it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a crack in the wall, and Margaret would take what she could get. Nathan's voice was thick with emotion as he continued. That was the night Danny started to heal. The night we became a real family. But danger was still coming. Tommy Jr. leaned forward. The man from Boston. Yes, William Thornton. And he had not forgiven. After the blizzard broke, Nathan returned from town with news. Town's buzzing about the Christmas social, New Year's Eve. Everyone's expected to attend, including us. Margaret's visible tension made Nathan pause. Something wrong public appearance. People will talk. People are already talking. He sat down at the table. Does that bother you? What bothers me is... Margaret stopped. Stories travel. If William is looking... Nathan understood immediately. A mail-order bride from Boston arriving in December, rejected by 23 men. That would be a story people remember. Margaret nodded, fear clear in her eyes. You don't have to hide, Nathan said firmly. If you hide, he wins. You'll come, you'll hold your head up, and you'll prove that their opinions don't define you. And I'll be right there beside you. The week passed in preparation. Margaret helped Sarah sew a nuka ribbon for her dress. Rose practiced her carol. Tommy talked endlessly about the promised cookies. And Danny surprisingly helped Margaret plan what food to bring. On New Year's Eve, they dressed in their best and made the journey to town. Bitter Creek's town hall was already crowded when they arrived, decorated with pine boughs and candles, a massive tree in the corner adorned with handmade ornaments. Margaret stepped down from the wagon and felt eyes turned toward her immediately. She straightened her shoulders and walked inside. Rose's small hand tightened hers. There she is, the leftover bride. Can you imagine standing in that church while everyone... Nathan Garrett must have lost his mind. Margaret kept walking, her chin high. Then a voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and commanding. Miss Hayes. Victoria Sterling bore down on her, resplendent in burgundy silk, several other well-dressed women flanking her. Mrs. Sterling, Margaret replied evenly. How lovely to see you. Is it? I imagine social gatherings must be somewhat uncomfortable for you, given your circumstances. Tell me, how are you finding life on the Garrett Ranch? Quite a step down from whatever you left behind in Boston, I'd imagine. Actually, it's quite a step up. Victoria's smile flickered. I beg your pardon. In Boston, I worked 16-hour days in a factory for pennies. I slept in a dormitory with 40 other women. I had no family, no security, no future. Here, I have honest work, a roof over my head, and 4 children who need me. So yes, Mrs. Sterling, it's a step up. The women around Victoria shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the response they'd expected. How inspiring, Victoria said, recovering quickly. A factory girl who's grateful for scraps. What I appreciate, a voice said from behind Margaret, is someone who works hard and treats my children with kindness, which is more than I can say for most folks around here. Nathan stepped up beside Margaret, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. Protective. Claiming. Nathan Victoria's tone shifted, became sweeter. I was just getting to know your new employee. She's not my employee. She's part of my household. Nathan's voice was flat, dangerous. She's proven herself 10 times over. And if you've got something to say about her, you can say it to me. The hall had gone quiet around them, people watching openly now. Well, Victoria said, her composure cracking. I can see you've been thoroughly convinced of her virtues. I've been convinced by her actions, which is more than I can say for words from people who've never worked a hard day in their lives. He guided Margaret away, his hand never leaving her back. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. It'll make things harder for you, publicly defending me like that. I don't care. He stopped, turning to face her. Listen to me, Margaret. Those people, their opinions don't matter. What matters is what happens in our home. What matters is that my children are happier than they've been in years. What matters is that you've given us something we'd forgotten we could have. What's that hope? His voice was rough, almost angry. You've given us hope, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away. The music started near 8, a fiddle and guitar playing folk tunes that set feet tapping throughout the hall. Children ran in circles. Couples took to the dancing area. Margaret danced with Rose, first spinning the little girl in circles until they were both dizzy. Then Tommy demanded his turn. Then Sarah, who moved with unexpected grace. Then the music changed, slower, more intimate. Partner dance, the fiddler called. Grab your sweetheart and hold them close. Margaret started to retreat to the edge of the room, but a hand caught her elbow. Dance with me, Nathan said. If you're willing. She should say no. This was exactly the kind of thing that would feed the gossip blur the lines of their practical arrangement beyond recognition. Yes, she heard herself say, I'm willing. He led her onto the floor, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. They were closer than they'd ever been, and Margaret could feel the heat of him through her dress, could smell wood smoke and leather, and something underneath that was just Nathan. I'm not much of a dancer, he admitted. Neither am I. Then we'll stumble through together. They moved slowly, finding a rhythm that was more shuffle than waltz. Around them, other couples glided with practiced ease, but Margaret barely noticed. Her whole world had narrowed to this. Nathan's hand warm on her back, his eyes locked on hers, the impossible intimacy of moving together in a room full of people. Margaret, his voice was rough. Yes, these past weeks, having you here. It's been, he trailed off, struggling. It's been the first time I've felt like I could breathe since Rebecca died. The words came out in a rush as if he'd been holding them back too long. I didn't expect that. Didn't want it at first. Felt like betrayal letting someone else into the space she left. And now I think maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd want me to stop just surviving and start living again. He pulled her slightly closer, their bodies almost touching. You make me want to live again, Margaret. I don't know what to do with that. Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it. I don't know either, she admitted. This wasn't supposed to be. I know. His thumb traced a small circle on her back, the gesture somehow more intimate than a kiss. But here we are. Here we are. The song ended. They stood there for a moment, neither willing to step apart before the reality of their surroundings crashed back in. Pa Tommy's voice cut through the moment, high and urgent. There's a man asking about Miss Margaret, a fancy man from the east. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She spun toward the entrance and saw him standing there. William Thornton, in a coat that cost more than most people earned in a year. His eyes scanning the crowd with predatory patience. When those eyes found her, his lips curved into a smile that made her stomach turn. There you are, Mara. He'd always called her that, a corruption of her name that she hated. You've led me quite a chase. Nathan stopped, his hands clenched on the arms of his chair. And that Tommy was when everything we feared came true. William Thornton had found us. Tommy Jr. leaned forward at his own fears temporarily forgotten. What happened? We fought, Nathan said simply, with everything we had. William Thornton stood in the doorway of Bitter Creek's town hall, like a predator surveying his hunting ground. The crowd seemed to part before him, people instinctively moving aside as he walked forward. His face was handsome in a cold, practiced way, and his smile never reached his eyes. Nathan stepped between Margaret and William, his body a barrier. Who the hell are you? William ignored him, his gaze fixed on Margaret. William Thornton from Boston. And you must be the rancher who's been housing my property. Your property? Nathan's voice dropped to something dangerous. Margaret worked for me. Left rather abruptly, actually. Stole some things on her way out. I've come to collect what's mine. I didn't steal anything, Margaret said, finding her voice past the terror closing her throat. I took what was mine and left. William's smile widened. The dress you're wearing, I bought it. The shoes on your feet, mine as well. And the debt you incurred during your employment room board training, that certainly hasn't been repaid. I'm a reasonable man. Come back to Boston with me. Work off what you owe and we'll call it settled. She's not going anywhere with you. Nathan hadn't moved, his body still blocking William's view of Margaret. This is a private matter between myself and my former employee. There's nothing private about a man stalking a woman across the country. Nathan took a step forward, and something in his posture made William take a step back. I know men like you. I've seen what you do to people who can't fight back. But Margaret's not alone anymore. She's got a home. She's got family. And if you want to take her, you'll have to go through me. A new voice cut through the tension. Mr. Thornton, I believe you need to leave. Sheriff Morgan Blake pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. The lawman was older than Nathan, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by expensive coats and practiced smiles. On what authority? William demanded. On the authority of me having sent telegrams to Boston, Blake said calmly. Police there have several complaints from former female employees. Seems you have a pattern, Mr. Thornton. William's face paled. Those are baseless accusations. Maybe, maybe not. Blake's hand never left his gun. But I figure if I hold you here while they sort it out, we'll find the truth eventually. Or he smiled, and it wasn't friendly. You can leave tonight, get on the first stage, coach out, and never show your face in Montana again. Your choice. The silence stretched. Margaret watched William calculate, watch fury war with self-preservation behind his eyes. This isn't over, Mara Williams said finally, shaking with barely controlled rage. You'll regret this. All of you will. It is over, Margaret said quietly. You just haven't accepted it yet. William stared at her for a long moment, a look of pure hatred that made her skin crawl. Then he turned and walked out into the night, the door slamming behind him. Margaret's legs gave out. Nathan caught her before she hit the floor, his arms wrapping around her, holding her up when she couldn't hold herself. It's all right, he murmured against her hair. It's all right, he's gone, you're safe. He'll come back, she whispered. He always comes back. Then we'll be ready. Together. Nathan pulled back to look at her face, his hands cradling her cheeks. You're not alone, Margaret. Whatever comes, you're not alone. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, processing, recovering from the spectacle they just witnessed. Margaret was dimly aware of Danny gathering his younger siblings, of Sarah's protective arm around Tommy, and Rose of Victoria Sterling, standing white-faced near the wall for once, without anything to say. But mostly she was aware of Nathan, his hands on her face, his eyes locked on hers, his promise hanging in the air between them. Not alone, Shawnee. She'd been alone her whole life, had learned to expect nothing else. But here now with this man and his children and the home they were building together, maybe alone, wasn't her future anymore. Take me home, she said. Please, Nathan, take me home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The children huddled together in the wagon bed, shaken by what they'd witnessed. Margaret sat pressed against Nathan's side, no longer caring what anyone thought about the closeness. When they finally pulled up to the house, Danny was the first to speak. That man, the one from Boston, he's the reason you left, isn't he? The reason you came all the way out here. Yes, and he followed you, tracked you across the whole country. Margaret nodded. Danny's jaw tightened, his young face set in an expression that reminded Margaret of Nathan. Then he's an idiot, because he's not getting you. You're ours now, and we don't let go of what's ours. Sarah added, her voice soft but certain. We protect our family. Tommy pumped his small fist in the air. Yeah, we'll fight him. Rose simply held Margaret tighter, her small arms wrapped around Margaret's waist with surprising strength. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of fear or grief. They were something else entirely. These children claiming her as theirs, standing ready to defend her. Come on, Nathan said gently. Let's get inside. It's cold and you've all had a long night. After the children were settled in bed, Nathan and Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table. The fire had burned low, casting more shadows than light. Tell me everything, Nathan said. About Boston, about him. So Margaret told him. All of it. 13 years working in Thornton's textile mill. His attention starting when she was 25. The promotion offers that required private meetings. When she refused, the harassment began. Threats to blacklist her, ruin her reputation. His hands on her in darkened hallways, his breath hot on her neck as he whispered what he wanted from her. The day she finally ran, stealing away in the night with nothing but 17 cents and the clothes on her back. He put his hands on you. Nathan's voice was controlled, but barely. It wasn't a question. Yes. I should have hit him. At the social, I should have. If you had, you'd be in jail and he'd still be free. Margaret reached across the table, taking Nathan's hand. You did exactly what needed doing. You stood between me and him. You made it clear I'm not alone. That's what matters. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing circles on the back of her hand. Margaret, I need to ask you something. She waited, her heart suddenly pounding. When you stood on that platform in the church when those 23 men turned away, did you ever imagine ending up here? I imagined survival, Margaret said honestly. Not joy, not family, not love. She paused, the word hanging between them. And now I imagine mornings making breakfast while you drink your terrible coffee. I imagine watching these children grow up, teaching them everything I know. I imagine growing old in this house, being buried in this land. Her voice broke slightly. And it terrifies me, Nathan. Because I've learned that imagining things just makes it hurt more when they're taken away. Nobody's taking anything. Nathan stood, moving around the table to her. I won't let them. He pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face. I'm asking not as an arrangement, not as a practical matter. I'm asking because I love you, Margaret Hayes. Will you marry me properly, forever? Yes, the word came out broken, tearful. Yes, Nathan. Yes. He kissed her then. Really kissed her the way she'd been wanting him to for weeks. His lips were warm and demanding and gentle all at once, and she melted into him, her injured shoulder, forgotten everything, forgotten except the feeling of finally being exactly where she belonged. Pause, kissing Miss Margaret. They broke apart to find Tommy standing in the doorway, his eyes wide as saucers. He's really kissing her on the mouth, Danny. Sarah paused, kissing Miss Margaret. Footsteps thundered through the house. Within seconds, all four children had assembled, staring at the adults with varying expressions of shock, delight, and fascinated embarrassment. It's about time, Danny said, crossing his arms, but he was fighting a smile. Does this mean she's going to be our real mama now? Rose asked, tugging at Sarah's sleeve. Sarah looked at Margaret, something hopeful and vulnerable in her eyes. Does it? Margaret looked at Nathan, then at the children. These four young people who'd lost so much, fought so hard, and somehow found room in their hearts to let her in. If you'll have me, she said softly, I'd be honored to be your mama. For real. Forever. Rose broke first, launching herself at Margaret with the full force of a 4-year-old's enthusiasm. Tommy followed, then Sarah, then surprisingly Danny, who wrapped his arms around all of them in a hug that was more tackle than embrace. Nathan stood watching, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. Looks like it's settled, then, he said roughly. We're getting married. When Tommy demanded, tomorrow, can it be tomorrow, not tomorrow, son? We need time to plan to do it proper. How about New Year's Day, Danny suggested. That way it's a fresh start. A new year, a new family. Nathan looked at Margaret. New Year's Day works for me if you're willing to have a short engagement. I've waited 28 years to find a home, Margaret said. I don't want to wait a single day longer than I have to. Nathan paused in his story, his old hands gripping his coffee cup. Tommy Jr. sat transfixed, his draft notice completely forgotten. We were engaged, Nathan said, planning a wedding for New Year's Day. But William Thornton was not a man who accepted defeat. What did he do? Tommy asked, though from his grandfather's expression, he could guess the answer wouldn't be pleasant. He tried to take everything from us, Nathan said quietly. He tried to burn it all down. New Year's Day dawned cold and clear. The household was preparing for the wedding. Margaret was cooking, the children were decorating, and Nathan kept checking the windows with a frequency that spoke to his unease. I need to check the far pasture, he announced at midday. Make sure the cattle are secure before the ceremony. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, turning the sky the color of old iron. I'll go with you, Danny said immediately. No, Nathan was already pulling on his heavy coat. Stay here, watch your siblings, keep the fire going. If I'm not back by nightfall, don't come looking. I know this land. I'll find shelter if I need to. He kissed Margaret goodbye, brief and promising to return, then swung up onto his horse and disappeared into the gathering storm. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. The storm hit with full force, wind howling around the house, snow driving against the windows. The children grew restless, then worried, then frightened. Where's Pa? Tommy asked, for the 10th time, his voice small. The storm slowed him down, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady even as her own fear grew. He knows what he's doing. But Danny met her eyes across the room, and she saw her own terror reflected there. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning. 2. At 2:30, the door burst open. Nathan stumbled in, ice crusted on his eyebrows and beard, his face raw and red from the cold. He was limping badly. Horse-spooked, he gasped, his words coming through chattering teeth. Threw me. Legs hurt. Not broken, but... He winced as he tried to put weight on it. Couldn't ride. Had to walk. Margaret's blood ran cold. A couple hours in this weather injured on foot. It was a miracle he'd made it back at all. Danny, help me get your father to the fire. Tommy, wake up. I need hot water and blankets. Move. The boys scrambled to obey. Together, Margaret and Danny managed to get Nathan to the chair by the fireplace. His hands were like ice, his lips blue, tinged, his whole body shaking with cold that had seeped into his bones. Need to warm you up, Margaret said, pulling off his frozen coat, his gloves, his boots. Slowly. Too fast could shock your system. How do you know that? Danny asked, bringing armfuls of blankets. Factory workers froze sometimes in the bad winters. I learned what helped. They worked together, warming Nathan by degrees. His shaking gradually subsided, color returning to his face, his breathing evening out. The cattle he managed finally. They're secured, but something spooked them. Something wasn't right. What do you mean, found tracks? Human tracks near the fence line, fresh before the snow covered them. Nathan's eyes found hers, dark with meaning. Someone was out there, Margaret, watching. Fear clenched her stomach. William, it had to be William. Dawn came gray and bitter. Margaret woke stiff and cold, still curled against Nathan in the chair, where they'd both finally succumbed to exhaustion. She extracted herself carefully and moved to stoke the fire back to life. That's when she smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke from the fireplace, but something sharper, more acrid. She ran to the window and looked out. The barn was on fire. Massive flames were consuming the structure, greedily devouring dry wood that had stood for decades. The sound was deafening even through the closed windows. Roaring fire, screaming horses, the crack and pop of exploding timber. Nathan, her scream tore through the house. Everyone woke at once. Chaos erupted. Nathan tried to stand, but his injured leg gave out immediately. 3 horses were trapped inside the burning barn, including Storm, Danny's beloved mare. The horses. Danny was already at the door. Pa, the horses are in there. Nathan struggled to his feet again, determination overriding pain. You can barely walk, Margaret said, blocking his path. Danny's already moving. I'm faster. I'm not hurt. Nobody goes alone, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the panic with surprising authority. To Nathan, stay with the little ones. To Danny, with me, we go together. To Sarah, keep Tommy and Rose inside no matter what. She grabbed her coat and followed Danny into the inferno. The heat hit them first intense, even through the bitter cold. The sound was overwhelming. Flames roaring, horses screaming, timber cracking and falling. Margaret and Danny ran through the snow toward the barn, their breath coming in gasps. The main door was jammed. Danny pulled and yanked, his face desperate. It's locked, he said, horror dawning in his eyes from the outside. He turned to Margaret. Someone locked it. Someone wanted the horses to die. Someone wanted us to die trying to save them. Margaret understood immediately. William's revenge. But there was no time to process that now. Side entrance, she said. Help me dig. They clawed through the snow with bare hands, the cold burning their skin as badly as the nearby flames. Finally, the door gave way. Smoke billowed out, thick and choking. Stay low, Margaret gasped, pulling her scarf over her nose and mouth. The horses are in the back stalls. They crawled through the smoke-filled barn, the heat intensifying with every inch. Margaret's eyes streamed, her lungs burned, but she kept moving. She could hear the horses now, panicking in their stalls, unable to escape. Danny reached the first stall, wrestling with the latch. It stuck. Margaret grabbed a pitchfork from nearby, using it as a lever. The latch broke free, and the horse inside bolted past them, racing for the door they'd left open. 2 more stalls. Margaret's arms screamed with effort as she broke the second latch. Another horse freed another panicked bolt toward safety. The 3rd stall. This was Storm, Danny's mare. The boy was trying to calm her, but the horse was wild with fear, rearing and kicking at the burning walls around her. A beam cracked overhead. Margaret looked up and saw it, splitting flames eating through its center, the whole thing starting to give way. Danny, move. She threw herself at the boy, knocking him sideways as the beam came down. She felt searing pain across her shoulder, smelled burning fabric, heard Danny's scream mixing with her own. Then they were rolling, scrambling, Storm racing past them as the 3rd stall collapsed behind her. All 3 horses saved. Go. Margaret shoved Danny toward the door. Go, go, go. They ran, stumbling, falling, pushing through the smoke toward the rectangle of gray light that marked the exit. Margaret's shoulder was on fire, literally on fire. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, just kept moving until she burst into open air and collapsed into the snow. Danny was beating at her shoulder using handfuls of snow to extinguish the flames that had caught her coat and dress. "Miss Margaret, you're hurt. I'm fine." She wasn't fine. The pain was excruciating. We got them all. Behind them, the barn roof collapsed with a roar that shook the ground. 4 months of hay and equipment and memories turning to ash. But the house still stood. The horses had survived, and Margaret and Danny were alive. Nathan reached them seconds later, limping through the snow, his face ashen. "Margaret. Oh God, Margaret." He saw her shoulder where the fabric had burned away, revealing raw, blistered skin. "I'm all right," she said. "The horses are alive. Danny's alive. That's what matters." The children arrived, Sarah with Tommy and Rose, all of them watching in horrified silence as their barn burned to nothing. "It was him," Danny said, his voice shaking with rage. "That man from Boston. He did this." "The door was locked from the outside, Pa. Someone locked it. Someone wanted those horses to die. Someone wanted us to die trying to save them." Nathan stopped, his hands clenched. Tommy Jr. was leaning forward, completely absorbed. "That was when we knew," Nathan said. "When we understood just how far William Thornton would go. He'd tried to murder us. All of us." "What did you do?" "We went after him," Nathan said simply. "Your grandmother and I. We rode out to end it. Where would he go?" Margaret asked through the pain in her shoulder. "After something like this, where would he hide? Old Miller cabin," Nathan said. "Only shelter within riding distance. If he's still in the area, that's where he'd be. Then that's where I'm going. Not alone. Your leg." "I said, not alone." Nathan turned to Danny. "Take the children inside. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but us. Can you do that?" Danny wanted to argue. Margaret could see it in every line of his body, but he was his father's son and he understood duty. "Yes, sir, I can do that." "Good boy." They rode through the smoking ruins of their barn, 2 people on 2 horses, both injured, but both determined to end this. The ride to Miller's cabin took 20 minutes, Margaret's shoulders screaming with every step, but she held on, focused on what lay ahead. The cabin came into view, tilting and half collapsed, but smoke rose from its chimney. William's horse was tied outside. Nathan pulled his rifle from its saddle holster. "Stay behind me." They approached on foot, covering the last distance carefully. Through the dirty window, Margaret could see a figure pacing, agitated. Nathan kicked the door open with a crash. William spun, his eyes widening with shock, then narrowing with fury. "You should be dead. Both of you should be dead in a burning barn. Is that what you were hoping for?" Nathan's voice was ice. William's composure shattered completely. "I don't know what you—" "There's kerosene on your boots," Nathan interrupted. "Same kind we use to start fires." "You want to tell me how that happened?" William's face went from pale to flushed with rage. "You don't understand. She belongs to me. I invested in her. I gave her everything and she—" "I gave you nothing but my labor," Margaret said, stepping past Nathan into the cabin. "I owed you nothing but my work, and I did that work for years. You're the one who decided you wanted more. You're the one who couldn't accept no for an answer." She stood before him now, close enough to see the sweat on his brow, the fear in his eyes. "You were ungrateful," William said, but his voice shook. "I was a person, a human being with the right to say no. You never saw that. You saw property, an investment, something you could own because you had money and I didn't." William lunged for her. He was faster than she expected, or maybe she was slower, weakened by injury and exhaustion. His hand closed around her burned shoulder, and agony shot through her body. She screamed, twisted, tried to break free. Then Nathan was there, slamming William against the wall, pressing the rifle barrel to his throat. "Give me a reason," Nathan said quietly. "Give me one reason not to pull this trigger." William's eyes bulged with terror. "You wouldn't. You're not a murderer. I'm a man who just watched someone try to burn my family alive. I'm a man whose wife died while he was helpless to save her. I'm a man with nothing left to lose except the woman standing behind me. You tried to take her. You tried to kill my son. You tell me what I wouldn't do to stop you." Nathan, Margaret touched his arm. "Look at me." He didn't move. "Nathan, please. He's not worth becoming something you'll regret." Slowly, so slowly, the pressure eased. Nathan stepped back, the rifle still raised, but no longer pressed against William's throat. "You're going to walk out of this cabin," Nathan said. "You're going to get on your horse. You're going to ride straight to Bitter Creek. You're going to find Sheriff Blake and confess to arson and attempted murder. And if you try to run, if I ever see your face in again, he will kill you. No warnings, no trials, just a bullet in your head. Understand?" William nodded frantically. "Then move." They escorted William back to town, Nathan riding behind with the rifle never wavering. By the time they reached Bitter Creek, word of the barn fire had already spread. Sheriff Blake was waiting. William Thornton, the lawman, said, taking custody of the trembling man, "You're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and probably a dozen other things I'll figure out once I start investigating. You have anything to say?" "I confess," William whispered. "I confess to everything. Just keep him away from me." Blake looked at Nathan, at the rifle still in his hands, at the cold fury barely contained in his eyes. "Probably wise," the sheriff agreed. Margaret watched as William was led away, his elegant coat stained with soot and snow, his careful composure utterly destroyed. She'd been afraid of this man for years. She'd run across a continent to escape him. And now he looked like exactly what he was. A small, pathetic man whose only power came from money and intimidation, both of which had failed him here. "It's over," Nathan said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "He's done. He can't hurt you anymore." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let relief wash through her, to finally release the fear she'd carried for so long. But all she could feel was the burning in her shoulder and an exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach her bones. "Take me home," she said. "Please, Nathan. Take me home." They rode back to the ranch as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The barn was gone, nothing left but smoldering ruins and the lingering smell of smoke. But the house still stood. The horses had survived. And 4 children were waiting on the porch, their faces lighting up as their father appeared over the ridge. "Is it over?" Danny asked, running toward the approaching horses. "Is he?" "It's over," Nathan said. "He's in custody. He'll never hurt anyone again." The children swarmed around them. Danny, Sarah, Tommy, Rose, all talking at once, crying and laughing and asking questions faster than anyone could answer. Margaret slid from her horse, swaying with exhaustion, and found herself surrounded by small arms. Rose clung to her leg. Tommy hugged her waist. Sarah pressed close to her uninjured side. And Danny stood before her, his young face fierce with emotion. "You saved Storm," he said. "You ran into that fire and saved my horse. We did it together. You got burned for me. For my horse." Margaret cupped his face in her hands. "Your horse isn't stupid, Danny. And there's nothing I wouldn't do for this family. Nothing. Do you understand that now the boy who had watched her with suspicion for weeks, who had tested her and pushed her and waited for her to fail, finally broke? He threw his arms around her and sobbed against her good shoulder, letting go of all the grief and fear and desperate hope he'd been carrying. "I believe you," he whispered. "I believe you're staying." "I'm staying," Margaret promised, holding him tight despite the pain in her shoulder. "Forever. I'm never leaving any of you." Nathan's voice was soft now, full of memory. "We were married the next day," he said. "New Year's Day, 1891, in this very house." Tommy Jr. looked around the familiar room as if seeing it for the first time. "Right here, right here." Nathan gestured to the space before the fireplace. Reverend Hayes came out. Some of the neighbors. We didn't have much, but we had what mattered. Despite everything, the wedding went forward. Or perhaps because of everything. After facing death and emerging together, there was no reason to wait any longer. The ceremony was small. Reverend Hayes officiated. A few neighbors who'd softened toward Margaret came to witness. The children stood in the front, dressed in their best, their faces solemn with the weight of the moment. Margaret wore her cream wool dress, the burn on her shoulder bandaged beneath the neckline. Sarah had woven a crown of dried flowers for her hair, and she carried Rebecca's recipe journal clutched to her chest. Sarah's gift that morning, a symbol of acceptance and continuity. Nathan stood at the front in his cleanest clothes, still worn but dignified. Danny served as best man, standing tall and proud beside his father. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Hayes began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Nathan Garrett and Margaret Hayes in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over Margaret. She'd never imagined hearing them spoken for her. Never thought she'd stand before God and community and family claiming someone and being claimed in return. "The couple has chosen to write their own vows," the Reverend said. "Nathan, you may begin." Nathan took Margaret's hands in his rough calluses against her work-worn palms. "Margaret," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "3 months ago, I walked into a church expecting to do my duty, to find someone practical who could help with my children and my home. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't sure I believed in it anymore." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "But then I saw you standing there, chin up, telling the world exactly who you were, even though no one wanted to hear it. And I thought, there's a woman who doesn't quit. There's a woman who fights for what matters. There's a woman I could spend my life beside. I wasn't wrong. You've proven yourself in ways I couldn't have imagined. You've won over my children, stood up to people who tried to destroy you, and walked into a burning building to save what I loved. But more than that, you've made me believe again, in hope, in second chances, in the possibility that life could be more than just survival. I promise to love you, Margaret, to protect you, to stand beside you, to be your partner in everything. Not because I have to, because I want to, because you're the best thing that ever walked into my life. And I thank God every day that I was wise enough to step forward and claim you." Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her face. She'd sworn she wouldn't cry, but the vows she'd prepared scattered like leaves in her mind. "Nathan," she managed, "when I stood in that church waiting to see if anyone would want me, I wasn't hoping for love. I wasn't hoping for family. I was hoping for survival. A roof over my head, food in my belly, work to fill my days. That's all I thought I was worth." Her voice broke. "You proved me wrong, not just by stepping forward. Anyone could have done that. But by seeing me, really seeing me, not as the leftover bride, not as the factory girl, not as the woman no one wanted. You saw someone worth choosing, worth defending, worth loving. Your children taught me what it means to be family. Your home taught me what it means to belong. And you taught me that it's never too late to start over. That wounds can heal. That love is worth the risk even when you've been hurt before. I promise to love you, Nathan, to be a mother to your children, a partner in your work, a companion in your days. I promise to never quit on this family no matter how hard things get, because you didn't quit on me when everyone else did. And that's a debt I'll spend the rest of my life repaying." "Not a debt," Nathan murmured, lifting her hand to his lips. "Just love." "By the power vested in me, Reverend," Hayes said, smiling despite the tears in his own eyes, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Nathan, you may kiss your bride." Nathan pulled Margaret into his arms and kissed her. Really kissed her in front of Bob and their children and half of Bitter Creek. The room erupted in cheers, but Margaret barely heard them. She was too busy kissing her husband, tasting salt that might have been her tears, or his feeling the solid warmth of him against her. They were married. She had a family. She had a home. She had everything she'd never dared to dream. Nathan's voice brought Tommy Jr. back to the present. "And that grandson is how your grandmother and I began, how we became a family." Tommy looked at the photographs on the wall with new eyes. "But that was almost 30 years ago. What happened after?" "We lived," Nathan said simply. "We built a life. We raised those 4 children. We survived more winters than I can count. We buried the barn that burned and built a new one. We turned that ranch into something we could be proud of." He stood slowly, his old joints protesting, and walked to the mantel. He picked up a photograph, this one showing the whole family much later. Nathan and Margaret in their middle years, surrounded by grown children and grandchildren. Danny became a doctor. He's in Billings now, saving lives instead of grieving over the one he couldn't save. Sarah married a clerk, became a teacher. She's got 3 children of her own and still reads Jane Eyre every year. Your father, he runs the ranch now. Took it over when I got too old to keep up. And Rose, she became a nurse serving at the military hospital. He set the photograph down gently. "And your grandmother and I, we had 27 years together before she passed. 27 years of mornings making breakfast. 27 years of watching those children grow. 27 years of building something that will last long after we're both gone." Tommy Jr. stood walking to his grandfather's side. "But how did you know it would work out? How did you know she was worth choosing?" Nathan turned to face his grandson fully. "I didn't know," he said honestly. "That's the thing about courage, Tommy. It's not knowing everything will be fine. It's choosing to step forward anyway." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your grandmother stood in that church with 17 cents to her name. No family, no home, no future she could see. And she chose to get in that wagon with a stranger. She chose to fight for a place that didn't want her. She chose to love children who expected her to leave. She chose to walk into a burning barn to save what mattered. She didn't know any of it would work out. She just knew she was worth more than the world was telling her, and she refused to accept anything less. Tommy looked down at his draft notice still clutched in his hand. I'm scared, Grandpa. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? You might fail, Nathan said. You'll definitely be scared, but you're a Garrett, and Garretts don't quit. Not when your grandmother stood in that church, not when I stepped forward to claim her, not when she walked into that fire, and not when you step onto that transport ship to France. He squeezed his grandson's shoulder. You're worth more than you know, Tommy. You always have been, just like your grandmother. The world just hasn't caught up yet. A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret entered, older now at 55, her hair silver but her eyes still fierce. The scar on her shoulder was visible where her collar shifted, a permanent reminder of the day she'd run into fire for her family. Tommy, dear, she said, has your grandfather been telling you the whole story? Every word, Grandma. Good. She crossed to them, bringing the scent of fresh baked bread. Then you know what I'm going to tell you. You're scared. That's normal. That's human. But being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. It means you're choosing to do something hard despite the fear. She took his face in her hands the same way she'd taken Danny's face all those years ago. You're going to war, Thomas. You're going to face things that will test everything you are. But you come from people who've been tested, who've stood when others ran, who've chosen love over fear again and again. She smiled. And when you're over there, when you're awed and scared and wondering if you'll make it home, I want you to remember this. Your grandfather chose me when no one else would. I chose to stay when everyone expected me to leave. And together we built something worth fighting for. That's what you're going to do, Tommy. You're going to fight for the people you love, for the home you'll build someday, for the family you'll have, just like we did. Tommy hugged her, this woman who'd been rejected by 23 men and had become the heart of a family that now spanned 3 generations. I'll come back, Grandma. I promise. I know you will, she said, because you're worth coming back to. And don't you ever forget that. Tommy Garrett Jr. shipped out to France 2 weeks later. He carried with him his grandfather's words, his grandmother's wisdom, and the story of how 2 broken people had chosen each other and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. He came back in 1919 whole in body, if not entirely in spirit, carrying the weight of what he'd seen. But he came back to the ranch where his grandparents still lived, where his father still worked the land, where Sunday dinners gathered 3 generations around a table that Margaret had set thousands of times. And when he married in 1921, it was Margaret who helped his bride plan the wedding. It was Nathan who stood beside him, older and slower, but still strong in the ways that mattered. And it was the story of that December day in 1890 that Tommy told his own children when they asked how Grandma and Grandpa Garrett had met. A woman nobody wanted became a woman everyone needed, he would say, and a man brave enough to step forward when others wouldn't found the love of his life. That's our family, kids, built on courage, built on choice, built on knowing your worth even when the world tells you otherwise. Nathan and Margaret lived to see those grandchildren grown. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1941, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them descendants of a chance taken in a Montana church on a cold December day. When Nathan passed in 1943, at 92 years old, he died in the bed he'd shared with Margaret for over 5 decades in the house they'd built together on the land they'd fought to keep. His last words were to her, "Best decision I ever made was stepping forward that day." And when Margaret followed him 2 years later, at 73, her children found her in the kitchen where she'd made 10,000 breakfasts, where she'd taught her children and grandchildren to cook, where she'd turned 17 cents and a desperate hope into a legacy that would outlive them all. On her finger, she still wore the simple gold band Nathan had placed there on New Year's Day, 1891. And tucked into her apron pocket was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a younger version of herself, surrounded by 4 children who'd learned to call her Mama. On the back, in Nathan's careful handwriting, were the words he'd written on their first anniversary. She was worth choosing, she was worth loving, she was worth everything. And so the story ended where it began, with worth, with choice, with love, with a woman nobody wanted who became the heart of a family, with a man who'd forgotten hope learning to dream again, with 4 children who'd lost their mother finding something new, not instead of what they'd had, but alongside it. The barn they rebuilt after the fire still stands on the Garrett Ranch today. The house where the wedding took place is still there, preserved by descendants who understand what was built within its walls. And the story of Margaret and Nathan, is still told to children who need to hear that sometimes the person nobody wants becomes the person someone needs most. That worth isn't determined by others. That love is always worth the risk. That home isn't a place you're given, it's something you build with your own 2 hands and defend with everything you have. And that sometimes on a cold December day in a frontier church, when you're down to your last 17 cents and your last shred of hope, someone steps forward and says the words that change everything. I'll take her.